So, what are those books that you fall back on when you're feeling a bit down or a little bit overwhelmed? Some of you may know that about a month ago I was laid off from my job, and now I make videos and I write for a living, which on the one hand is incredibly freeing and probably means that I'm the happiest I've ever been. And on the other hand, brings with it a whole new set of challenges and brings with it a whole new chance to succeed, but also lots of chances to fail. And I'm the type of person, and I imagine you might be too, that when I'm faced with those sorts of challenges, I tend to fall back on books. Books that have stuck with me for a long time, books that have resonated with me or taught me something. And I thought we could talk a little bit about some of those today. One of my favorite works of philosophy, actually, is this book by Boethius called The Consolation of Philosophy. You could see my rather beat up, torn up Penguin Classics edition. This is the story of a man in prison. He has fallen out of political favor, despite the fact that he sort of played the political game in Rome for quite some time. And now he thinks he's going to be facing execution. And he's dealing with the fact that he's lost his social status and he's lost access to his family and he's lost everything that he thinks makes life good. And then he sees this vision, and the vision is this woman who's like beautiful and kind of glorious, but then is dressed in like dusty and sort of fraying robes. And this is Lady Philosophy. This is the philosophy that Boethius has learned, which in Boethius's case is basically a kind of Christianized Neoplatonism. Lady Philosophy has been neglected. That's why she's all frayed and dusty. And she is going to come to Boethius and comfort him by reminding him of the philosophy that he has already learned. Boethius, it turns out, knows how to be happy. He just has forgotten all of the lessons that he learned once. The book is really interesting because while there is a plot, you sort of see the spiritual or intellectual progression of Boethius throughout the book. There's also just a lot of poetry. There are these songs that Lady Philosophy sings to Boethius that kind of serve as comfort for him. Now, we know that Boethius dies. We know that Boethius eventually does not make it. And you might even suspect that Boethius knows that's what's coming. Even though, obviously, the execution can't be in the book because he couldn't write about his own execution, he sort of seems to know that things are not going to turn out well for him from sort of an earthly point of view. And yet this is how Boethius is able to end his book. A great necessity is laid upon you, if you'll be honest with yourself, a great necessity to be good, since you live in the sight of a judge who sees all things. Obviously, that is the sort of Christianized Neoplatonism coming out most explicitly in this book. But I think what we see here is that even when he's faced with kind of the darkest moments, he's taking a very classical philosophical approach to his problems, which is to say that regardless of the circumstances he's found himself in, and regardless of the whims of fate or providence or luck or whatever it is that you want to call it, he still has the ability and in fact the necessity to go and be good. And I'm someone also who thinks that the study of philosophy is not separate from that fact. You know, in the classical world, philosophy was seen as a way to help you live a better life. Better here meaning a lot of different things and not just meaning that you're always feeling happy. And that understanding of philosophy broke down eventually, and we largely abandoned it. And it's one that I still cling to, and one that I still, hope makes sense in the long run, because that's how I like to think about things, and it's how I like to live. We'll stick with classical authors for now, and let's talk about this little book by Seneca. This is Hardship and Happiness. This is the edition that was published by the University of Chicago. If you've heard me talk about Seneca before, you know that this is the edition that I recommend. I think you should, if you're buying anything by Seneca, look for what the University of Chicago is putting out first. The reason that I picked this book in particular and not like the Letters on Ethics, or which is sometimes called Letters from a Stoic, is that there's this one particular essay in Hardship and Happiness called On the Shortness of Life. Seneca addressed this letter to his father-in-law. And it's kind of a gutsy thing to write to your father-in-law because it's basically you giving him life advice. I love my father-in-law. I don't know how often I give him life advice, but maybe that's just the kind of relationship that he and I have. So in this essay, Seneca is trying to make sense of this feeling that we have like our life is too short, like we're always running out of time. He ends up encouraging his father-in-law to think about what it is that he wants to accomplish and think about what it is that he wants to do, and then to set about actually the work. Someone who doesn't have a purpose or a mission or a goal in mind, Seneca compares to a ship, a man on a ship who has left the harbor and then immediately is caught in a storm. The waves go back and forth and it's wild, and he's out to sea for a very long time. And then when the waves calm down, he's able to return to the original harbor. And Seneca uses this phrase, it's not much voyaging, but much tossing about. And that's very easy for us to experience, I think. We can feel like we're being sort of pushed and pulled by the winds of fate, and we can feel like there's much tossing about, but there's no actual voyage, even if we spend a lot of time at sea. I wrote about this essay early on over on my Substack, which is linked down below, shortly after I got laid off, and realizing that perhaps the idea of losing a job, while there is hardship associated with it, obviously there are things that go wrong when you lose your job, things you have to think about: money, healthcare, health insurance. We live in the US, so health insurance is a big deal. Thinking about also not just the things that go wrong, but what are the opportunities that have arisen because of this, and then also just honestly asking, what is it that I would want to be doing with my time? And what is it that I would actually like to be trying to accomplish? You know, it might not seem like it from the outside because you guys only see just like when I post videos or something, but I have done more in the last month to accomplish some really long-term, big picture goals for myself than I probably have in the last 3 years. The level of attention and dedication I've been able to bring to some of the things that I'm trying to accomplish, I just wasn't feeling that before. And I think previously I was the man who was being tossed about by the waves, but wasn't actually voyaging. And reading Seneca, especially early on after getting laid off, became a reminder that I actually wanted to be on a voyage, which means I wanted to be going somewhere, which means I needed to start steering the ship. Actually, I'm just flipping through the essay now, and I see this part that I underlined where Seneca even says, like, sometimes you'll see people with gray hair and wrinkled faces, which I'm getting there. You can sometimes see the grays on camera. And Seneca says that that's not a mark that he's lived long. All it shows you is that he's long existed. And there's a difference between living long and existing for a long time. And I think that's a nice, powerful, very poetic, but a really incisive way to put things. It wouldn't be a discussion of philosophy books on this channel, I think, if I didn't talk a little bit about Plato. Now, usually when I talk about Plato, I would hold up smaller volumes, but I just grabbed the complete works to show off a little bit, I guess. I often recommend to beginners in philosophy this set of dialogues, which is published by Hackett under just 5 dialogues. Sometimes these essays, maybe some omissions and other things, are repackaged as the death of Socrates or the trial of Socrates. And that's because the trial and death of Socrates really is actually kind of stretched out across multiple Platonic dialogues. And I'm thinking mostly, though, about actually Plato's Apology and Crito. In the Apology, Socrates is on trial. The word apology here is actually coming from the Greek word that's more like for like a defense. Socrates actually kind of famously doesn't say that he's sorry in that dialogue. So Socrates has eventually been condemned to death after he refuses the lesser sentence of being exiled for kind of various personal and philosophical reasons. So we've seen a kind of injustice against Socrates because whatever Socrates was up to, he was not guilty of the charges that were actually brought forth by him. And, you know, Plato strongly implies that it was Socrates' ability to make powerful people angry that led to him being put to death. This might fuel, by the way, some of Plato's more anti-democratic sentiments. In Crito, though, Socrates' friends want to break him out of prison, to let him run away and escape. And Socrates refuses. He says no. And he goes through lots of different reasons for this, about his loyalty to the city and things like this. But I think, honestly, the most important part of that dialogue has to do with Socrates approaching death. And this is where you sort of get this famous characterization of philosophy as preparation for death, as preparing you to die well. And you could quibble with many of the different things that Socrates says. Socrates famously says that he's not afraid of death because either death is like falling asleep, or he gets to go to what the Greeks thought the afterlife was like, and he would just get to go and talk to Homer, and that's not a bad way to spend your time. You can quibble, obviously. Most of us don't believe that that's what the afterlife is like, if there's an afterlife at all. But what I liked about it was that Plato shows that Socrates has such courage and strength of his convictions, that he is willing to stake it all. He believes these philosophical arguments. He finds them compelling. He thinks he's been led to the truth. And if this means he has to accept death at the hands of the city that he loves, the city that he has actually helped defend, Socrates was a soldier at one point and fought for Athens, and then Athens essentially betrays him. But he accepts that betrayal, and he accepts the consequences, and he does so with a kind of peace. The Greeks are sort of obsessed with this idea of living the good life, but they're also obsessed with this idea of like sort of inner peace. I imagine some people are going to say that there is some overlap between sort of Buddhist ideas and ancient Greek ideas. And I think when you look at the details, they're very different, but an approach to becoming happy that involves a kind of stillness, ataraxia, I believe is the Greek word, which was really taken up, especially I believe by like the Epicureans, who would say that the greatest pleasure is the absence of pain. So even though they were hedonists, they actually led rather moderate lifestyles that were tried to avoid pain at all costs, you might say. But Socrates seems like he had achieved that inner peace, that stillness, a kind of peace and stillness that I don't think I've ever experienced. I've mentioned before that I'm fairly prone to anxiety. I'm just prone to anxious thinking. And so achieving some kind of peace through philosophy, I mean, that's the dream, right? And even though I'm not there, it's something I think about and kind of aspire to. We're going to leave the classical world, not going to talk about Greeks and Romans anymore, and instead talk about someone who wrote in French, and then we'll move on and talk about some writers who wrote in English. The book I have in mind of the writer in French is A.G. Sertillanges' The Intellectual Life, which is my preferred little red book. If I had to say what this book is about, the answer is how to be an intellectual, which sounds hopelessly pretentious. And I think when I've mentioned this book before, people think that if they don't consider themselves intellectuals, then why would they want to read a book like this? But actually, I think deep down, this book is about vocation, meaning whatever it is that you feel that you are called to do. And so the early chapters on the intellectual vocation really could be generalized to not just talk about intellectual work, but really to talk about any kind of work where you feel called to do it, and that means that you have to make changes in your life, including giving things up, in order to be able to do it well. So while yes, this book has many great things to say about note-taking or how you should read or why you need to read Thomas Aquinas in Latin, which I wouldn't do, but it's actually the early chapters on spirit and on vocation that are the most helpful for me. And when I revisit this book, which I like to do every so often, I mostly read those early chapters again, but almost every chapter here is truly great. Chapter 3 on the organization of life, which includes simplification, solitude, cooperation with one's fellows, cultivation of necessary contacts, safeguarding the necessary element of action, and preservation of interior silence. You can see how these are, a lot of this stuff kind of be traced back to Plato even. And then it gets eminently practical. Why you should work at night, why you should work in the morning, why you're probably doomed if you're trying to work in the middle of the day. Just all kinds of thoughts like that going on in this book. It sort of keeps me on track as I try to work on larger projects, bigger projects. You know, I've got longer videos than I'm planning. I put out one on Stoicism. I liked it. I could do better. And I have been thinking about other videos kind of in that vein I could do and thinking about what I could improve. And it's this kind of book that I think keeps me on track as I think about that stuff. Few writers have been more inspiring to me than Ursula K. Le Guin, especially her book, The Dispossessed. And I was going to include it in this list to talk about Chevèque as a sort of misunderstood freethinker who's trying to live up to his own ideals and not making a lot of friends along the way, and about courage and bravery there. And I guess that itself is a plug for The Dispossessed, but you've probably heard me talk about The Dispossessed in many different videos before because I love Le Guin so much. So we're going to skip over Le Guin today. And instead, I want to talk to you about this book by Walter M. Miller, A Canticle for Leibowitz. Like every book in this video, I love this book. But the reason that I think about this book when I'm going through hard times is that this book has a really interesting structure. And I'm sorry, there are a few spoilers here, so you could skip ahead if you really wanted to avoid those. But there's a kind of, there's 3 parts to this story, each with a different main character, but none of the main characters' stories end well. Their individual stories are quite bad. Main characters in this book tend to die, and societies tend to crumble. This book is set in a nuclear apocalypse. So then each story that we're told is in different areas of recovery, getting further and further away. We're starting almost in the immediate aftermath, maybe a generation or two away, where society is barely rebuilding. And most of the characters are monastics. They're monks living in this desert and trying to make do. But they're monks who are dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. They exist in large part to pass things on to further generations. And as we go from each epoch, we've seen new levels of progress, to the point where in the second story, we're living in a more organized world with scholarship arising again, but also there are still warlords and there are still people fighting for power. And then eventually we reach back to an area of more technology, even with like spaceships and things. But that society also ends in nuclear war. And yet the book, despite ending on such dark notes, the book ends up being hopeful the entire time. I mean, which is a real accomplishment. And it's a nice kind of way of perspective setting, thinking about ways that things have gone wrong or could go wrong, and ways that things can look like huge defeats, both for you or for mankind or for some organization. And yet they end up being still successes in some fashion. And I do think it was that kind of single-mindedness on their task of preserving knowledge and being able to pass it forward that allows them to still succeed. If you're single-minded about your certain task, if you really know what it is that you're pursuing and what it is that you don't care about, you can face many different setbacks, and yet you can continue to do quite well. And that's what I usually get when I think about Mechanical for Leibowitz. Many people are surprised to find out that I love Christopher Hitchens so much. And this is his Letters to a Young Contrarian, which I think is my favorite book by Hitchens. A theme is emerging that I wasn't really planning in this video, because unlike some other videos, this was just like literally, I thought of the idea, I went to my bookshelf, I looked, and I was like, oh, these were the books, and I was able to grab them. But a theme is emerging of that kind of sense of purpose based on whatever it is that your chosen vocation is. And Hitchens is sort of writing these letters to a fictional character who has asked him on how to become a professional contrarian. And of course, in like true Hitchens fashion, it starts with him talking about how he hates the word contrarian, despite the fact that he's been called one, and despite the fact that I think you could say like he is one, like professionally is what he did. It ends up being about the task of writing, about the task of a critic, about the mistakes to avoid. And at the same time, it's also Hitchens making fun of himself or making fun of the literary world, which I find quite inspiring. This is one of those short little books, less than 200 pages, actually just cracking 100, it's like 130 pages. You can read it in an afternoon, and you'll come away seeing how, like a really incisive cultural critic, a critic who went wrong sometimes. I think of his stuff on like the Iraq War. Still, I think a very insightful and incisive social critic. Well, and if you're ever struggling to figure out what your place in the world is, well, seeing someone confidently talk about their place, I think is a good way to maybe slightly get your bearings. And I found that with Hitchens. And we'll talk about one last book today, which is The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. This is a poetry collection, and maybe this is not the book, and maybe that is not the genre that you would think about when you're thinking about those books that help you. You know, a lot of the books that you might think about, like philosophy, but if it's like practical philosophy, makes perfect sense. Practical philosophy is about how you live your life. Fiction at least has a plot, which means it has struggle, which means there's something that has to be overcome, and so you could kind of see that. With Hitchens and Sertillanges, at least you could see that they're writing about some topic that I personally find helpful to think about, and so maybe that's the real like value here. But poetry's not like about anything. And if poetry gets too didactic, it just like tells you too much about what you ought to believe. It sort of loses its power as poetry, I think. But what I like about Wendell Berry is the sense of groundedness and peace that you find in his writing. This is a man who's like lived in basically one place his entire life, has come to know it in a lot of beautiful ways, has come to know it with a lot of detail and immersion, and his little area of Kentucky ends up being a microcosm for the entire world as he thinks through life. Now look, if I'm thinking about my favorite Wendell Berry collection, I'm probably thinking the Mad Farmer poems. It's what he's most famous for, I think, and they're probably the better poems in my mind. But The Peace of Wild Things has this peace to it, this kind of tranquility there, which again is one of those emerging themes in a list like this. All right, I'd love to hear down below if you have books that you sort of lean on or go back to when you have hard times or when you're struggling with something. I'm sure some people would benefit from seeing more recommendations, and it's always just fun to hear from you. All right, I hope you got something out of this, and I'll talk to you soon.